Let's walk through an example that deals with creating an entity relationship diagram in Lucidchart. This particular example will deal with a theoretical library. So let's take a look. Here's some initial information. Suppose a local library wants to keep a database of books, patrons, desk attendants, and lending records. The library needs to know which patrons are checking out which books. For instance, Sam borrows The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, along with The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. The first question we should ask ourselves is, what are the entities of interest? Well, one way in which you can figure this information out is to concentrate on the nouns, or what we might call the things that are talked about. In this case, there are 4: books, patrons, desk attendants, and lending records. So let's begin by creating these entities on an entity relationship diagram in Lucidchart. So here we are in Lucidchart. There are many ways to create an entity relationship diagram using Lucidchart. Let's look at one way to open up a document. If I go over here to where it says plus document, I can create a blank one and go from there, but I'm going to make it a little easier on myself. I'm going to click the little drop down arrow and it brings up a bunch of templates. What we want is an entity relationship diagram. So over here under categories, I'm going to choose entity relationship, ERD, and I'm going to pick from the templates the blank ERD. Now this will take a moment to come up. But when it does come up, I'm presented with a blank sheet. Over here in the shapes, you'll see down near the bottom it says entity relationship, and you can make this window a little bit more pleasant by moving the shapes in the order you choose. But we need the entity relationship shapes. Some of these other shapes may come in handy later on, such as text and other things where we can add notes, but for now we just need the symbols here under entity relationship. Now the name here says blank ERD. If I click on that, I can change it, and I'm going to do that here. I'm going to call it ERD Example Library and hit OK. Now that we have our ERD blank example open, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the 4 entities that are mentioned in the presentation. Now there are a couple different ways we can do this. If we look at the shapes for entity relationship, we see 4 different ways to add an entity. For us, the 2 we should really focus on are the first one, which is the bare minimum. This is akin to the examples that you saw in the presentation from this week. The second one is more similar to what we see in Microsoft Visio, where you have an additional sort of column there within the rectangle allowing you to specify a primary key and a foreign key. What I'm going to do is stick with the simple one, just for the purposes of what we're doing here. So what I'm going to do is click and drag, and now I'm ready to customize it. By default, a little window pops up. We'll come back to that window later. What I'm going to do is highlight the entity text, and I'm going to change it to the name of my entity. In this case, book. And you'll notice here that I'm using singular names, and that's a convention that you often see. I just click off anywhere, and then I go back and add a new entity by clicking and dragging. And this one I'll call patron. And again I click off. And I move another one. And this one we'll call desk attendant. Now notice here I'm using one word, no spaces, although I'm capitalizing desk and capitalizing attendant. The reason I do this is because when we get to implementation, we can only have single word names. Now sometimes we use underscores to separate those names, sometimes we don't, but in the end it has to be a single word, a single contiguous block of characters, no spaces. So I'm just getting in that habit now. And I had the fourth one, which is lending record. Now I have a base that I can build off of, so let's take a look at some more information about this business case. Let's take a look at some more specific information about this business case. For each book, the library only maintains the unique ISBN number, which is the unique identifier for a book, the title, and the author. For patrons, the library maintains the library card number, the name, first and last, and an email address. For desk attendants, the library only maintains a unique attendant ID and a name, again, first and last. What this information is telling us is information we need to figure out what are the attributes or fields that these entities, which we've already created, need to have. Another thing that's helpful in here is the word unique. When we use the word unique, it often helps to point out a primary key for the entity. Not always, because of course there can be other fields which are unique, but very often the use of the word unique is meant to imply that this particular attribute is a primary key. So let's take this information and add to our entity relationship diagram. Okay, now we're back in our ERD diagram. So let's start adding those attributes. I'm going to start with desk attendant. A couple ways to do this. Most simple way is to click on your entity, go to the Manage Fields button, and start typing in the names. Now in this case, I'm going to call the unique identifier for a desk attendant just desk attendant ID. ID is a typical name that you see employed when it comes to unique identifiers. And of course the other two attributes would be first name and last name. Now desk attendant ID I want to be the primary key. If I highlight that text and click the U on the toolbar, it'll underline it for me, and it helps to visually represent it as the primary key. I'm going to do the same thing with book. Again, I'm going to click on the entity and hit the Manage Fields button. Now this one I'm not going to call ID, I'm going to call ISBN because that's a formal name given for the book's unique identifier. My other two attributes are title and author. And I'm again going to underline ISBN to indicate it's a unique identifier, specifically the primary key. Now patron, I'm going to manage those fields as well. Now there were 4 fields for patrons. I'm going to start with the library card ID, the first name, and again using one-word names for my attributes, last name. Now I need one more. You'll notice here there's a green circle with a plus in it. If I click that once, it adds another field. And this one I'm just going to call email. And when I hit OK, I see, and let me click off a moment, we see our 3 entities, book, patron, and desk attendant, with the attributes filled in. And of course I can't forget to underline the library card ID as the primary key of patron. Lending record we really haven't dealt with yet. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But right now we've got all of our attributes, at least as far as we know now. We're going to save this. And we'll go back and take a look at some more information. Let's take a look at our final set of information regarding relationships. For lending records, the library needs to maintain the book, who checked out the book, when it is due back at the library, and which attendant processed the checkout. Each book is borrowed by only one patron at a time for a fixed period of 30 days and cannot be renewed. A patron can check out multiple distinct books at a time, however. So what information can we gather from this for our entity relationship diagram? Well, notice how the lending record ties together information about 3 things: the book, the patron, and the desk attendant. What this does is make lending record an associative entity, tying together information from multiple tables. This is also an associative entity because there is a many-to-many relationship between book and patron. One book can be checked out by many patrons over time, and one patron can check out many books over time. There's also a many-to-many relationship between desk attendant and book. A desk attendant can process the checkout of many books, and a book can be processed for checkout by many desk attendants, again over time. So let's take this information and put it into our ER diagram. Okay, remember that with a many-to-many relationship, we want to convert that into 2 one-to-many relationships with an associative entity in between. So let's tackle them one at a time. Let's start with books and patrons. Patrons can check out many books, and a single book can be checked out by many patrons. So our associative entity is going to be lending record. What we're going to do is rearrange this a little bit. I'm just going to move some things around to give me a little more space. And I'm going to add two one-to-many relationships, one from book to lending record and one from patron to lending record. Now the way in which you do this is if you hover your mouse over one of the entities, you'll see all these little dots pop up around the border. What I'm going to do is click on one, and I'm going to drag, and I'm going to attach it to a dot on another. What happens here is by default a one-to-many relationship pops up. Now we don't have all the cardinality information we might want here, so we have to add that. What I'm going to do is highlight the line by clicking on it, and up here on the toolbar, for the many side, I have many different options about how I can write this. Now I'm going to put this symbol on the many side. Now what this means is that a book can be part of 0 or many lending records. It's possible that a book is never checked out. On the other end, for every lending record, it should be associated with one and only one book. Again, going to the toolbar, I'm going to change the symbol for the opposite side to be one and only one. Now what I could do with the line if I wanted to is I could make it thicker, a little bit, make it a little darker, things like that. So I'll make that a little brighter for us. Actually, I guess I'll change the color. I'll make that. That's not very good. Let's do that. Oops, I forgot to highlight the line. So I'm going to change that to black so it stands out a bit more. Now I need another one-to-many on the opposite end of this relationship, so I'm going to move desk attendant for now. And I'm going to take patron, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to click on one of the dots on the one side and drag it to one of the dots on the many. Now again, by default, it doesn't show the complete cardinality information, so I'll go through the process of changing the many side to be 0 or many, and the one side to be one and only one. Now these are identifying relationships. And what that means is we have a solid line for each of the relationship lines, which I'm going to make that a similar weight to the other. But what it also means is for our fields for lending record, we have to borrow part or all of our primary key from the two related entities. So what that means for us is ISBN will be one of the fields from book, and library card ID will be one of the fields as well. Now both of these will be part of the primary key, but they will also be foreign keys. So I'm going to italicize them. Okay. Now we're not yet done, but we're going to leave this alone for now. But just recognize that associative entity borrows, if you will, part or all of its primary key from the two related entities. Here they're indicated to be that way, part of the primary key by being underlined, but also foreign key, which we indicate with italics. If you use different entity symbols, like some of the ones we mentioned earlier, you can specify PK and FK for each field. Now, we have one more entity here, desk attendant, which needs to factor in. We said this was also part of a one-to-many relationship. A desk attendant can check out many books, and a book can be checked out by many desk attendants. So where to put this? Well, we're going to move over patron, we're going to move over book, and we're going to put desk attendant here in the middle. Now really, the way you arrange these things on the screen is largely a matter of preference and your level of neatness. I encourage you to be as neat as possible when it comes to these things, because some of them will get quite large and can get quite complex. So desk attendant is part of the lending record in the sense that a book is checked out by a patron and processed by a desk attendant. So I'm going to add a relationship line between desk attendant and lending record. Now here, as far as the cardinality, for the many side, I'm going to say one or many. because every book has to be processed by a desk attendant if it is checked out. Also, for the opposite side, we want one and only one. Now the question is, should this be part of the primary key? Well, if we're implementing this many-to-many relationship, the idea is yes, it should be. We mentioned before that books cannot be renewed, but that doesn't necessarily prohibit a book from being checked out at a later date for a second time by the same individual. So, we will add a field here called Desk Attendant ID. We will make it underline and italic, part of the primary key and a foreign key. Now, one other thing that's part of the lending record, which we didn't mention yet, is the date in which it's due. So we are going to have a fourth attribute here. So I'm going to add one more. Call it due date. Now that should not be underlined and italicized. It is not a primary key, it is not a foreign key. The due date is actually a fact about the relationship. Now I'm going to make this line the same weight as the others. Okay. But here we have an associative entity, and this is really an M-way relationship between book, desk attendant, and patron. One question that you can ask, and should be asked perhaps, about this business case is, well, is it possible for a book to be checked out a second time by the same patron and have the same desk attendant check that book out for them? Well, that would be something you would go back to the client and ask about. So how would you deal with this type of situation? Well, there are a number of different ways you could attack it. One might be to add due date to the primary key, the composite primary key and lending record. This perhaps is not the best solution because dates are usually shunned as part of primary keys. You could add a fourth field representing some unique identifier for the lending record. But in terms of pure design, you may need to add a fourth entity to help act as an intermediary between these three entities: book, desk attendant, and patron. There are a number of different things you could do. For now, take a moment to look over this particular ER diagram and make sure you understand how we got here and what the different symbols mean. We'll be sure to see them a lot more in the future. But wait, there's more! The library has suggested that it is possible for a patron to check out a book more than once, as we suspected, though they cannot renew it. They have asked us to fix the potential uniqueness problem with the lending record entity. So how do we address this? There's a few different solutions we could take. Here's the one we're going to take. If we add a lending record ID attribute to the primary key, what that means, we can remove the other three attributes from the primary key. They would still be foreign keys, however. That would also mean that there would no longer be identifying relationships, because lending record ID alone would uniquely identify each row of lending record. So that'll change our model a little bit. Let's take a look. Okay, let's make the changes we just mentioned. First, I'm going to add a new field to lending record. I'm going to add one called lending record ID. And we can assume this will be some uniquely generated number. Now, lending record ID I've placed here as the second attribute in our list. But I'd really rather it be the first because it's going to be the primary key. So what I'm going to do is click over here where you have these two little up and down keys, and I'm going to drag, and in that way I can rearrange the attributes to be whatever I want. Now it automatically underlines itself because of the other ones around it. So what I'm going to do with the other three is take away the underlines. I'm going to remove them from the primary key. Now we have one primary key, one attribute, lending record ID. What that will mean is the other three relationships that are attached to it will no longer be identifying because the primary keys of the one side do not contribute to the primary key of the many side. So I'm going to highlight each relationship line and change it to a dash line to signify it's non-identifying. And this changes our model quite a bit. Now again, there are multiple ways you could do this, and there is some subjectivity involved. This is one approach that you can take. Lending record now has a unique primary key, lending record ID. Now we don't worry about the implementation details. That will be up to whomever implements the database to ensure that that value is unique. And we have 3 foreign keys, ISBN going to the book table, library card ID going to the patron table, and desk attendant ID going to the desk attendant table. Due date is a fact about the M-way relationship, specifically when the book is due. And we have 3 relationships coming in, none of which are identifying relationships. This is still an associative entity in the fact that it relates these 3 entities together. However, it is a rare occurrence that when you have an associative entity, that the attributes themselves coming from the one side don't contribute to the primary key. But sometimes it happens.